comes a new challenger.
An integral feature of fighting games includes the use of special attacks. Unlike basic punches and kicks, in most cases, these special moves employ a combination of button presses to perform correctly. This is a form of game design that rewards and encourages the player to spend more time playing and learning your game and its mechanics. It's mainly for this reason each character will have a unique or different input to perform a special move. It also allows the player to further differentiate each character from one another aside from visual aesthetics. Generally, stronger special moves will have a more complex input or can only be performed at a specific time, while weaker special attacks reward new players with a sense of accomplishment without them having to spend the time or energy to master more complex moves or mechanics. With that said, let's begin creating our character's fireball projectile special attack. For this, we'll simply need an animation, some particles, and a 3D mesh for our projectile. In the link in the description, you'll find a link to freely download the assets and scripts or macro we created in this video. Feel free to download them and follow along, dissect the particle system, scripts, or macro, or to simply use the completed effect in your game or project. Let's begin by adding our fireball animation to our character's animation controller. And let's add a parameter trigger which we'll call Special 01, and then make a connection from our idle to our fireball animation state, and then back from our fireball animation state to our idle animation state. And we'll use the Special 01 trigger as the condition to start our fireball animation. With that complete, let's next create the material and particle effects for our energy charging mesh and projectile. So with our meshes selected, let's create or extract the materials into our material folder. For our projectile fireball mesh material, we can simply change our shader into an unlit particle shader. And let's change its render mode to additive and its color mode to overlay. Then let's adjust the color tint in alpha as well as the emission color. Next, we'll set the materials of the charging energy ball. The energy ball has two materials. One material is for the ball itself, and the other is for the thinner meshes that surround it. For both these materials, we'll use a particle unlit shader, and we want to set the render mode to additive, and we want to set the color mode to overlay. We'll also make the tint a similar color to our fireball projectile, but for the emission and albedo map, we'll use our energy ball textures. At this point, we can make any further adjustments or tweaks to our materials to get the effect that we're looking for. With that complete, let's now begin creating a particle system for our charging energy ball. We'll begin by bringing our energy ball mesh into our scene. And let's first unpack it, since we'll be creating a prefab of this once it's complete. And we'll start by creating a particle system that will be a child of our energy ball game object. We'll start by setting our lifetime to 2 and our starting size to 0.2. We'll next change our emission from 10 to 60 and our shape from a cone to a sphere. And we want to change the radius of our sphere from 1 to 0.1. We next want to go to our render dropdown, and we want to change our render mode to stretch billboard, and we want to then adjust our link scale from 2 to 10. Let's next enable our size over lifetime, and we're going to use a curve that starts at 0 and ends at 1. Let's next enable our trails, and for our trail material, we want to use one of our energy ball materials we just created. And we're going to set our width over trail to be 0.1, and let's next change that into a curve, and we want the beginning of our curve to start at 0, and we want the end point of our curve to end at 0.1. Let's also change the color over lifetime of our trails and the color over trail from colors to gradients. And we want the gradients to begin and end transparent before we set our alpha to 256. This way our trails will appear to fade in and out of our scene instead of sharply appearing then disappearing. And we can also add a bit of transparency so our trail doesn't appear solid color. Let's next adjust our maximum particles to 500 and change our starting speed from 5 to 0.9. And let's also adjust our starting color so our particles appear halfway transparent. And let's also enable our color over lifetime, and we'll again set our gradient to be transparent at both the beginning and end of a particle's life. And at the end color, we want our particles to go from white to the color of our energy ball. And let's make sure the position and rotation of our particle system is set at 0. And let's also increase the size of our width over trail. This way, our trail will appear a bit bigger before it fades out. Once we get the effect that we're looking for, we want to then adjust our velocity over lifetime, as well as our starting speed. For our starting speed, we want to change that into a negative. This will allow our particles to appear as if they're coming from the energy ball itself. The velocity over lifetime will give our particles a slight appearance of rotation, so we want to set our orbital x, y, and z to be 0.1. At this point, you can further tweak your settings to adjust the look of the effect, then move on to creating the next particle system. We'll start by changing our starting size to 0.05 and our starting speed to 0. We'll next change our emission shape from a cone to a sphere. We'll next reduce the sphere's radius and radius thickness. If we preview our particles, we can see that they now appear around our emission sphere, but since they don't have a speed, they simply appear and disappear. However, for this particle system, we want it to rotate around our energy ball object. So in order to do this, we can enable our velocity over lifetime and use this orbital effect to rotate our particles around the sphere. This is the basic effect that we wanted from this particle system. So let's go and tweak our settings before moving on. With that complete, let's create our final energy ball particle system. For this particle system, we simply want the energy that appears to be swirling around our ball to appear as though it's being released into our environment. So let's create another particle system as a child of our main particle system, and we'll simply reduce our particle starting size, as well as our starting speed and lifetime, and change our emission shape into a sphere. At this point, we can simply tweak its settings with the techniques we've learned until we're happy with its effects. With that complete, let's create one last effect that will make our energy ball appear as though it's growing as it's being charged. So let's create another particle system as a child of our main particle system. And we'll start by setting our starting speed to 0 and our maximum amount of particles to 1. Let's also adjust our emission rate to 1 and change our emission shape to be a sphere. Next, let's go to our render dropdown, and we want to set our render mode to be a mesh. And the mesh we want to use is our energy ball. And for our shape, we'll adjust our radius to its minimum size. Let's also change our material to one of the energy ball materials that we recently created. The two key factors in this particle system are our size over lifetime and our rotation over lifetime. Our rotation will help give the illusion of movement, and our size over lifetime will adjust the scale of our particle energy ball. At this point, we can simply continue to tweak our settings for this particle system until we can create the desired effect we're looking for. At this point, with our charging energy balls particle system complete, let's drag it into one of our project folders, turning it into a prefab, and delete it from our hierarchy. Let's also drag our fireball projectile mesh into our scene. Let's then unpack the fireball mesh within our scene. And let's also create an empty game object as a child of our fireball mesh. We'll set the X, Y, and Z position and rotation of our empty game object to 0 and add some of our energy swirl meshes to be children of our new game object. And we also need to be sure to unpack our energy swirl meshes as well. Next, let's create a 3D sphere as a child of our main fireball mesh. And let's create a new unlit particle material and assign it to our 3D sphere. And let's also scale our sphere down so that it fits within our fireball mesh. The reason we're placing this sphere inside of our fireball is to both occlude the inner polygons of our mesh, as well as to increase the emitted light from our fireball projectile. So let's go inside the fireball sphere particle material we just created and enable and brighten its emissive properties. With that complete, let's begin creating the particle systems for our fireball. We'll begin by adding a new particle system as a child of our main fireball mesh game object. The particle system we're creating will give the illusion of the energy surrounding and coming off of our fireball. So let's change our emission shape from a cone to a hemisphere, and we want its rotation to be 180 degrees in the x-axis. And let's also reduce its starting lifetime to 0.4, its starting speed to 3, and its starting size to 0.15. And let's also reduce the radius and radius thickness of our emission shape. Next, let's go to our render dropdown, and we want to change our render mode from billboard to stretch billboard. And for our stretch billboard, we're going to change our length scale from 2 to -5. Let's next enable our particle system's color over lifetime, as well as velocity over lifetime settings. For our color over lifetime, we simply want our particle to fade in and out in the beginning and end of its lifetime. For our velocity over lifetime, we're going to change the linear z-axis from 0 to -2. This will allow our particles to appear less spread out and more like it's being propelled forward. Let's also enable our particle system size over lifetime. We'll set the size to a curve, and we want our particle system to start at 0 and end at 1. At this point, the particles emitted from our fireball seem to be more like sparks and less like bursts of huge amount of energy coming from our fireball. In order to change this, we're going to enable trails on our particle system. For our material, we're going to use the Energy Ball Trails material that we recently created. At this point, we can see that we're getting a lot closer to the effect that we're trying to achieve, but in order for our effect to appear correctly, we'll still need to make some adjustments to our trail settings. Let's first disable our dye with particle setting and our inherit particle color. Let's next change our width over trail setting from 1 to 4, and then we'll change that from a constant into a curve. And the reason we increased our value before changing it into a curve is because it allows the maximum value of our curve to be the value we placed as a constant. For our curve, we want our beginning point to be 1 and the end point to be 4. Next, let's set our trail color over lifetime and color over trails to be gradients. For our color over lifetime, we simply want to set our gradient to start and end our trails transparent. For our color over trails gradient, we're simply going to start our gradient white and end it at black. Lastly, we want to adjust our minimum vertex distance from 0.2 to 0. At this point, we can simply increase our emission rate and further tweak our settings until the particle system achieves the effect that we're looking for. With our first fireball particle system complete, for our next particle system, we're going to simply duplicate our particle system and change our emission shape from a hemisphere back to a cone. We'll also lower our emission rate and adjust our particle and trails color and materials. We'll mainly use this particle system to represent the glowing white energy in the innermost part of our fireball. With that complete, let's create our last fireball particle system. For this last particle system, we simply want to create the appearance of small amounts of energy coming from our fireball, then dissipating into the environment. With that complete, let's create a prefab of our fireball and then remove it from our scene. With both the effects from our energy and fireball complete, let's move on to creating the mechanics for our projectile.
Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to be the first to see this and many other tutorials, game development tips, interviews, and free game asset giveaways.